containers and making sure that it doesn't exhaust the resources in a field. It moves them around and gives it certain barriers and parameters of what it's allowed to do. And once again, we're talking about your infrastructure being cattle, not a pet. So if something goes wrong, you just get another one. So all of these things introduce a number of complexities, primarily those being, like, from an IR perspective, tracing what happened in a container all the way up through the stack, back through like a Kubernetes infrastructure or something like that is a real headache. It's a very difficult thing to do and manage. And you're also increasing the amount of layers of identities that you have to manage your environment. And so the configuration of those identities and just tracing like who did what, where, and when, it just gets a lot harder. You're talking about a massive increase in logging. For those who are in our workshop, the lab that you stood up, an empty Kubernetes cluster with full logging enabled, is generating 3 megabytes of logs a second. It comes out of the box with hundreds of secrets already in it. So keeping track of logging in a production environment is incredibly expensive and difficult, to the point where many companies don't actually log everything like people tell them to, just because it's not affordable. You have a change in your attack surface. I'm not going to say if it's better or worse, it's just different, and different always means like starting over with trying to go through the process of finding everything that is wrong. You got a lot of people who are migrating to these ephemeral environments, migrating to clouds, doing hybrid clouds. Most of that time that's being done by people who haven't done it before. They're learning, so stuff happens. Identity management features again because it is a real pain. And ephemeral instrumentation, what we're talking about there is if you're running your business on shared hardware, there are certain things from an IR perspective that are not possible to do because you can't snapshot a tenant that you share with other people. So let's cover a bit about preparation for an issue when you've got like hackers or some kind of malware in these containerized or ephemeral environments. So preparation comes down to two main things. We're talking about prevention, that's sort of like your vulnerability management side of things, but also your collection, how you get ready to deal with these kinds of problems. And there's a lot of steps to prevention, but we're just going to cover a couple of the pink ones. The first thing that, generally speaking, people don't do is create an incident response project within their cloud provider, which has pre-configured sets of rules of like containment within that environment of like this project space has the capability to pull any container or any host out of another part of the business and pull it over here so that your forensics people can stare at it and do things to it or just like see what's gone wrong. Most people don't have that in advance, and when you don't have that in advance, then you have to do it on the fly, which is like difficult and a pain because you probably don't have permission. CI/CD controls are really important. If you are using your live environment to detect like issues where attackers are trying to enumerate permissions, like seeing if they can mount the host file system or trying to start a privilege process, those look the same as when developers are figuring out how to do Kubernetes. So you're going to have thousands of log events a day of people trying to do a thing while they learn, but then you can't tell the difference between them and an attacker. David, would you like to cover sandboxing and quarantining?
Yeah, just a note on that. So yeah, the idea with these controls is just make sure the developers are blocked before it gets into your environment, so you don't have those alerts firing. The sandboxing and quarantine patterning is basically the idea of isolating your processes. So you already have containerization, you already have things isolated. You want to have sort of, when he's talking about having that project, you want to have something where you can label an environment, label a workload, say this is quarantine, and make sure that no automated processes or other people come in and touch this workload because it's being under investigation. Think of it like putting crime scene tape up around a crime scene. Obviously. So The idea here is you want to there's a set of things you want to put in place we'll cover later to make sure that that nothing gets touched.
Yeah, one of the beauties of Kubernetes is you can, in advance through preparation, leverage a lot of automation in the IR process. You can literally type a one-line command to quarantine a host and have Kubernetes automatically go through a bunch of steps to like move workloads around, make sure that other pods or containers aren't issued to that node that you're having problems with, so you're not like having your workloads run next to a machine that you think might be infected. Security tools on the host is really important. Sometimes you're seeing people that are running their security tools in the container with the workload, which means that you're giving the attacker a lot of opportunities to fuck with that. And you're also giving the attacker a lot of opportunities to better understand what's happening in your environment and work around that. So you really want to make sure that your security tools are up one layer out of the container looking in. Now, the problem with when you do that is you've got now lower fidelity of what your alerting looks like because it's outside of the container. So a lot of traditional security tools really tend to fall over here because they're giving you low fidelity information and you can't tell what's going on very well. There's some new technologies like eBPF that we'll cover in a moment that really increase the level of visibility you get whilst keeping your tools further away from attackers. So when you have an event, the incident response process hasn't really changed in its fundamentals. It's just the processes that you need to go under look different. You still need logs, you still need live info, and you still need disk info. But the process of getting that is just a little different. So in many of these cloud or ephemeral environments, you have some new logging sources that weren't available to you before. Most of them are really well structured, really easy to read, and pretty good data sources, but they can be kind of expensive to collect. So you need to make some decisions about some of these sources and what you want from where, because you really want to drop down on the amount of duplication of the same information. And with that said, it's you don't want to ignore your application logs just because you can burn down the application and start over. A thing you hear a lot of people say about ephemeral environments is, oh, if it gets hacked, I'll just burn it down and spin up a new one, and then it's no harm, no foul. Well, the attacker will just come back through whatever mechanism got them there in the first place. Likely they'll just keep repeating that until they hit their end goals. So you really don't want to just neglect those sources of data that you think you don't need anymore. So collecting live info in these kinds of environments is certainly more difficult than it used to be. And I think the main takeaway from this slide is you need to really be prepared that the reality is that you're going to have more than one container infected at once. It's probably going to be multiple for a variety of reasons. And being prepared to take live info snapshots from multiple infected places at once is going to be key. Generally speaking, one of the tools that helps you with this in these kinds of ephemeral environments is called a container sidecar. This is basically a container that lives slightly outside of your workload container that, say, all the network traffic passes through. And it gives you a place to log and collect all that information. The issue is at many places, by the time the security team is brought in and said, hey, what do you need from these hosts to do your job? And you say, oh, I need a sidecar that does X, Y, Z. The business turns around and says, we're already running 3 sidecars. We can't add a 4th because latency, because cost, because complexity. And then now you have to figure something else out. So involvement and preparedness early on is going to be key. So with disk collection, this is generally speaking, this is a lot easier in cloud environments because you can just literally type a one-liner and snapshot a disk in 2 seconds. With containers, it's a little different, but the underlying file systems are going to be available through the provider to snapshot. And snapping a disk in a regular environment, that's no change there. what I would say is you want to make sure that your snapshots, you're going to be doing incident response in an environment you're not familiar with. It could be an application that's been affected at your business you've never even heard of because you have 3,000 of them. You're going to need to be able to diff the bad one against the good one or the known good one to just like narrow down the amount of stuff you have to look at. So if your plan is to do snapshots across your fleet, coming back to my earlier point about having an IR project that has permissions across the project space or across the fleet, in AWS or G-Cloud or whatever it is do you actually have permissions from a well-protected account to snapshot some host that you're worried about somewhere in like the retail side of the business, right? Or are you going to like have to go talk to 7 different people in order to do that? That's not going to be good enough when the time comes. And definitely worth noting that any incident response tooling or process is like hella powerful. So make sure that those accounts are well protected and audited themselves so that you aren't the cause of the problem. Here's a visualization of what I'm talking about here. So in Google Cloud or AWS, this is the typical structure of what the project spaces look like. Each line of business or project within your company is going to have different like project buckets. It's mainly done this way for billing purposes, so we can see if the factory is spending a lot more money than the retail side, or if the IT team is like spending too much money. But within this, you'll have a forensic space that'll have permissions to reach out and touch things in other places and pull them in. So a quick note on Kubernetes logs. So here's an abstraction of a very basic Kubernetes cluster with one node. A normal business might have 10,000 nodes, but each node has these logging components, and you can see that they're your container runtime and your pod loggings. These are additional logs on top of what you were collecting before, and all of this is being logged through a daemon set to the control plane. Now, a quick note on daemon sets that's really, really neat is a daemon set is set in like the manifest file that you deploy with Kubernetes, which is the list of instructions of what you want Kubernetes to do and where. And this daemon set basically says that every resource needs to have these minimum things installed on it. So you can use this as a CI/CD control where you can say in GitHub or whatever you use as a CI runner, every single thing in my business better have a manifest file where a daemon set is listed as our like SIEM, like Splunk or whatever tool you use for doing that. That means some application you've never even heard of within the business won't be able to deploy unless they meet your minimum requirements, which is going to be really, really important and easy and fun. So audit logging in Kubernetes, you see advice all the time from, everyone is just like, turn on Kubernetes audit logging. If you go to your business right now and turn on Kubernetes audit logging, full audit logging, you'll probably send the place broke by the end of the month. It's extremely expensive. You need to make really careful decisions based upon the logging you're getting elsewhere about what you can afford to get out of Kubernetes logs when you're running like full request response logging. Like I said, an empty cluster is generating 3 megs of logs every second. So a very large business might be running, $50 million worth of Kubernetes logs a month. Like that would be pretty much par for the course. When we talk about what these logs in Kubernetes look like, it's really nice human readable JSON. And all Kubernetes is making on the back end to do things is a bunch of HTTP web requests. So you can quickly look at this and see what is happening with like a create command. You can see the who, what, when, where, why. So you can see why everyone says turn on full audit logging, because all the information is right there and it's super easy. But yeah, you're going to want to balance this against joining logs from different sources in order to save money, unfortunately. So container forensics, you've used your logging and you've got a problem. Unfortunately, we can't just burn it down and start over. We do need to be able to tell a story about what happened. It won't be good enough to just say, yeah, we just burnt that down, we don't really know what happened and we're starting over. That's probably not gonna, cut it. So some general notes is, don't log into the container that you think is infected. You can stay on the host machine, but really you want to rely on your tools. Don't literally log into the container.
Ideally, you should never have to SSH into anything.
Right, yeah.
Or anything.
Yeah, ideally.
The host even.
Yeah. So, some of the strategies, Dave.
Yeah, this is my part. So, when you're dealing with an incident response, you sort of have to have sort of a plan ahead of time. You have to get playbooks, and so what we have here is sort of like the logic or the reasoning behind sort of the four main reactions to an event. So the first one is isolating. That's the one we were talking about. That's your best case scenario. That's where you take a workload that's infected, you move it somewhere, or you isolate it in such a way that it can't talk to other workloads, and you're able to take your time, look at what the attacker's doing, find out what they're doing, and from there, figure out what else they might be doing elsewhere in your environment. So that's your ideal. That's what you want to do. But there's cases where you may end up doing the other things. The other one's pausing. That's just where you stop the workload, but you don't destroy it. That's the next best case scenario. The third one is probably technically the laziest, which is just to restart the workload, but you may end up getting overruled by somebody in business who says, I just want things back up and running. And you don't have the choice of stopping things. You have to just get the business back up and running. So you sort of need to be prepared, but even then, you need to have sort of like a game plan on collecting the forensics, trying to keep the attacker cordoned in and not spread throughout your environment. The last one is killing everything, killing your workloads. This is basically the nightmare scenario where you end up you're trying to deal with something where the attacker's like leaking data. You have information compromised, that kind of thing. So I'll talk through these a little more detail. When you talk about isolation, we talked about there's a couple of strategies for this. Kubernetes has a concept called cordoning, which I'll talk about in a minute. But the idea is the first thing you want to do is, this applies to VMs, this applies to Kubernetes as well, is apply a label to your environment, label it. Maybe it's a label you don't want to be obvious to attacker. Oh, I'm under investigation. It's not something you want the attacker to see. But it's something that would immediately say, okay, do not stop this, do not stop or shut down or move or reschedule this workload. Keep it here, keep it running. And then based on that, you might have some other automated processes to do the following. The first thing you want to do is, if there's any security credentials tied to the pod or the workloads in there, you want to immediately, maybe if you revoke their access. Maybe keep them around, but don't, maybe change the roles, revoke the access to keep the attacker in, so they can't use those credentials elsewhere. You can also create network policy rules to block ingress or egress, especially to other portions of your environment. But you don't want pod-to-pod communication going on, that kind of thing. And then, of course, cordoning the node and draining other workloads off of it. So if you can't move it to a project, what you do is you make the node that it's running on, the workloads are running on, your effectively you make that your crime scene. You get everything, you give everyone else out, and you start examining the body more or less. The other thing you want to do is start capturing any volatile artifacts as ASAP. This is basically what's in memory. If you have logs that are going to the retention policies because of expense are very short-lived, you want to go ahead and start snapshotting those within the window, a certain window.
This will help people outside. I hear you.
Okay, great.
We have a microphone now.
Thank you. So yeah, this is just a quick demo of doing a Kubernetes cordon. So yeah, the idea behind cordoning is you're just telling the scheduler inside of Kubernetes, do not put any more workloads on this worker node. And once that's done, then you can start draining other workloads off, the ones that aren't infected or compromised. So, yeah, sorry, they're not compromised. Next one. The next strategy is pausing your workloads. Now, if you're taking a snapshot, generally the processes get paused anyway while you're capturing memory, that kind of thing. The other thing you might want to do this for is if you have a workload like a crypto miner that's consuming a lot of resources, that's where you'd want to pause a workload or at very least throttle it so it's not running up your bill. But yeah, it's possible. You may not want to do this because it may tip off an attacker that you're onto. Again, this is the one we talked about. The one you don't want to do is restarting it. It won't fix your problems. The attacker's just going to come back. The only reason you may want to be doing a restart is you're actually rolling out a phase, like you're redeploying or redeploying a new version of your application to fix the problem that allowed them in the first place. And then, of course, this is the final option. Thank you. This is your last resort option, which is just to kill the processes. Now, a quick note here is that when you do something called a Docker stop, it sends the process a nice kill signal. Well, this may tip off the attacker that the process is being killed, and they may have something automated to stay in your environment or whatever. You're tipping it off. So if you're doing a kill, you want to do like the hard kill, like basically the kill -9, where it just kills the process right away. This is the thing you would do if you were you see data exfil, or they've compromised your information. They're changing the information in your systems.
So let's talk a little bit about some fancy detection technologies that have come along to help simplify the process of seeing what's happening inside some of these ephemeral workloads, where things have been abstracted and it's getting a little bit more difficult. So eBPF was introduced into the Linux kernel in like December 2014, and it lets you extend the kernel, that's the operating system, without having to literally own maintenance in the operating system, which is something that most businesses do not want to do. It's extremely involved and time consuming and breaks a lot. It's very expensive. So this was introduced as a way to get kernel level observability and control without having to clear that huge bar of maintaining a kernel module. So how eBPF works is, it's kind of like if you are sitting in a restaurant and you want to know what's happening in the kitchen, like in the operating system of the place, you want to know, you're not allowed to interact with like the stove or anything else inside the kitchen of the restaurant. You don't work there, you're not allowed. With eBPF, you're basically putting an observing chef in the kitchen who can touch everything in the kitchen, open up and see what's going on, and react appropriately, and then let you know.
Like a health inspector.
Yeah, like a health inspector. So what is happening here is we can use eBPF to monitor anything that's happening within the kernel. That could be like system calls or network events or like any call to any kind of piece of hardware or anything like that. And we can report bits of that information that we choose back into the user space, like back into the normal place where users live. This technology is being used also for rootkits and malware as well. And so when you're talking about eBPF malware, you're talking about some of the most resilient and stealthy pieces of malware that you can possibly imagine. I have some information about a particular instance of this that happened over the course of like 8 years undetected. But if you've ever used TCP dump, you've used a tool called BPF under the hood, basically. And with eBPF, we've taken the concept of TCP dump and just applied it to every single thing within the operating system. So when you make a little observing chef to put in the kitchen, what you're saying is you're basically creating a list of hooks of things that might happen within the system that you care about, and saying, when you see this event, or this number of events, or this type of event, like, let me know.
So eBPF gives you really, really deep and detailed views into what is happening within the operating system. And because attackers can use eBPF too, it means that if an attacker is using eBPF and you are not, they have better control of your computer than you do. Because if you are using a tool like, say, using a little program like PS to see a list of running processes, well, if the attacker is running eBPF malware, they own whatever response that PS decides to give. So you can't fight eBPF malware without eBPF. And because of the amount of really, really detailed viewing you get, it really is one of the best ways to stay on top of a handle of what's happening within your containers. In this GIF here, let me see, which one is this? Okay, what we've got here is a GIF of an open source tool called Tracy, which is a kind of like an open source EDR you could think of, but for containerized workloads and various things of that nature. And all of its rules and detections are all eBPF based, meaning that they can't be tricked by really, really fancy rootkits. And you also get really, really high fidelity alerting and detection that it's very difficult for attackers to get around. An example would be a lot of tools like OS Query and different things like that are say pulling the bash history off a machine and then looking for times where someone catted some secret file could just be avoided by using a space in front of your command or a little bit of obfuscation or calling it through Python first. With these kinds of things, because you're really looking for a call made from the kernel, you can't trick that, right? Because at the end of the day, all of those abstractions are doing system calls under the hood.
Just to add a note to the eBPF is that we talked earlier about having to have sidecar pods or systems for monitoring, containers for monitoring. Also, having to have security tools running inside your Kubernetes environment with elevated permissions. eBPF, because it's running outside of it, saves you that trouble. You don't have to worry about giving it some service account that the attacker might target or exploit because it's in the kernel. It's going to see everything from outside the Kubernetes at the host level.
One really cool thing about eBPF is because you're talking about well-structured data, is there are a number of machine learning approaches or techniques that make quite a lot of sense to leverage alongside eBPF from a detection point of view, a research point of view, and a reversing point of view. You see a lot of strengths with behavioral profiling and anomaly detection. And I've been using eBPF and some reversing related things to monitor processes. And I'll give you an example of that shortly. So we can use eBPF alongside machine learning tools. In this example, we're just using TensorFlow to look for anomalies in the behavior of a process. So this could be used in a defensive capacity or a research capacity. In the example, we've taken a baseline of the behavior of a password tool called KeyPass. So for 30 minutes, we use KeyPass normally, and we just log all of the system calls that it makes into a histogram, which is basically just a CSV. And what happens then is we train a model on that data. It's just completely, just literally take the data as it is and train a model. And then we start messing around with KeyPass, doing things like, trying lots of wrong passwords consecutively. And you can see after the learning step, we save all of these samples and we do our malicious activity, and the tool will start reporting to us any system calls that KeyPass makes that it wasn't making before. So there's a lot of use cases for this, as you can imagine. If you're trying to find errors or weird behavior, you could pair this with something like AppArmor or SC Linux to refine your ruling to get yourself a nice runtime application security protection happening. I use this also against EDRs. The place I work uses, an EDR, something like CrowdStrike or Sentinel-1 or something like that, you can actually just monitor the EDR process while you build malware. And then since you can't see, the EDR is proprietary software, but if you're monitoring all its system calls, you can be aware of when it starts opening a lot of sockets and phoning home to find out what to do, or when it starts trying to read things about your files. You can literally see the uptick in system activity as an anomaly, and then you know if you're on the right track or not with hiding your malware. So, eBPF malware, as I mentioned, yeah.
One thing to note too is when you buy machine learning products, they're going to have their stuff trained on other environments. You're going to get more value out of training your models on your own environment first.
Yeah, thank you. So eBPF malware is really, really exciting area of space. So people make the argument that eBPF malware isn't that new or exciting because it's not that different to a ROP chain. But anyone who's ever used a ROP chain to try and maintain persistence at a business is probably never particularly shocked when they come to use their beacon one day and it's just not there, right? But with eBPF malware, you have something that's embedded into the operating system. It's passed static analyzer checks. It's now part of the computer. It's extremely stable. It's fileless and very, very sneaky. It only wakes up in order to react to something that happened. So it's not just actively burning all the time. In around 2014, Equation Group started using BPF malware. The piece of malware is called BVP47 if you want to look it up. I have 9 dots on the map, but there's actually should be 45 dots. I just got tired of adding dots. But this malware actually never got detected in the wild. It was only discovered and fully uncovered by Pangu Labs this year as a result of secret keys that were leaked as part of the Shadow Brokers leak a few years ago. So even with all of that leg up, it was still so stealthy that it took a very long time to uncover. And basically how it worked was it monitored the TCP drivers of the system, and when it received, how it received its commands and its instructions was the attacker would send a TCP packet to initiate a handshake that was actually out of the spec. They added a data frame outside of the initial handshake, and what that meant was the driver would say, oh, hey, I've received this out-of-spec thing, what do? That exception woke up the BVP malware, it read the commands, executed them, and then, phoned home if it needed to phone home, and then it just went back to sleep again until it received another out-of-spec packet. Now, if you're using IP tables rules to protect and close ports, well, the network driver is still receiving those packets even to a closed port, meaning that BVP malware can listen on a closed port. So I hope that you found some useful preparation steps within this talk, and you can leverage those in the future. We have labs and resources. All the labs that we did last night and at DEF CON are available at that URL. This talk will go up there shortly too, but I believe it's being recorded anyway. But you can use that to gather any additional resources you need.
Yeah, and then cover the last slide. The main thing we want people to get is you don't want to be doing your first time first time incident response should not be an alive event. There's lots of preparation and consideration needs to happen ahead of time, especially in terms of preparing your environment for the event and having those things like the labeling, automated processes and stuff like that set up so you can react very quickly because the workloads are ephemeral, they're not going to sit around for long. So the evidence may be destroyed by the time you'll react to a alert.
We can take a couple of questions.
Yeah, we have time for a couple. I have 50 questions for you actually.
Okay.
Nobody else.
Go ahead.
CI/CD. So I was on the other side. I was doing full stack, a lot of containers and all that. So number one, are there any good tools to scan your containers before you get them to production? Like, would you recommend that you and then two, how do you monitor CI/CD? Because I would run 50 times my CI to see something accomplished and deploy containers, and then, how can you monitor that and say it's not malicious, it's a developer? So the second question is even more.
Yeah, so the first question is, what are some tools that I can use in my CI pipeline to, basically do kind of like vulnerability scanning on the containers or pods I'm going to deploy? There's a few. The first one that comes to mind is semgrep. It has a paid and open source version, and it has out of the box on GitHub a number of rules of like safe container behavior, and a number of like patterns and anti-patterns that you can use for that. There's also a number of other products that are escaping my thoughts right now. I know that there's a security tool that GitHub owns that does it as well.
Yeah.
Snyk, SYNK, is another really good one with good sets of container rules. The second question is, how do I, within my CI pipeline, tell when a developer is the one behind the malicious attempt and not an attacker?
Yeah, exactly, because they could be deploying from CI to pre-prod or something. So I'm
Yeah, I mean,
times per day because they're testing.
Yeah, I can sort of answer that.
So your Kubernetes environment, you can usually set up like webhooks, or they have like sort of a admissions controller. So it's like you're trying to apply the pod to an environment. It'll do checks on the pod specs to say, are you defining resources? So the other things you can see is like, are you mounting host volumes? Are you trying to make it a privileged pod, which means the containers inside will be running with privileged permissions. You can have those things set in place ahead of time so that the developer will get denied before deployment, and that your detections will only fire if it gets deployed.
it's also a question of provenance. Your question is is the person pushing code the person pushing code? So that really comes down to what kind of authentication mechanisms are involved, and signing is involved in pushing code. Are you using WebAuthn and things like YubiKeys in order to authenticate to your Git repos in order to push code? And is there any signing on top of that, right? These are the kind of things that help you validate that the person doing the thing is that person. Any other questions?
I was just going to add, you can also collect the logs from that CI platform. So you're going to Git push, you can run these same logs with correlation to all these other elements.
Yeah, Ahmed in the back just said you can use the CI pipeline logs as well to help establish provenance about who did what.
With the really ephemeral workloads, did you find the behavioral profiling became really complicated, or is it easier to do?
Yeah. Ahmed asked, does behavioral profiling get easier or harder in ephemeral workloads? And I think the answer to that really has to do with how you can get your baseline profiles in the first place. Are your test cases built out enough to help you get quality baselines? So I think the ephemerality doesn't really change too much what kind of baseline you can get. But really, a lot of these these demos I showed of doing anomaly detection, they definitely work really well if you're just messing around with it on things that don't change too much. Let's say you ran a crypto exchange and you wanted to get really detailed behavioral profiling. You might put that just on certain key features that don't change very often, like access to very particular resources, rather than on everything. So you start with the keys of the kingdom that people don't touch much, and then expand as resources allow.
So crown vilification, and then monitor those behavior sets.
Yeah, if you have a very well-defined authentication mechanism that's established and doesn't change much, that's also very easy to instrument because there's only 3 or 4 things that they actually do.
And we've run out of time. If you want, you can ask more questions offline.